Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into, the fallout and reactions to a plane crash in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And our main source for today is a BBC article from Date of Article publication, and it's called Combative Trump Takes Aim at Diversity Policies After Air Tragedy.
It's going to be interesting to see how this event became, political football.
Yeah, how a tragedy, becomes something that's used to
Right.
to score points.
Exactly. And that's kind of the core of what we're looking at here, right? Not just the crash itself, but how those facts get spun and used for agendas.
Right. So for anyone who hasn't heard, two planes collided, one of which was an Army helicopter.
Oh, wow.
And the details are still coming out, but it seems like that the helicopter could have avoided the crash, but didn't.
And that alone, even without a confirmed cause, immediately gets people thinking, speculating what happened, trying to fill in the blanks when something so unexpected and tragic happens.
Absolutely. And to add to all of this, we've got some prominent figures on board, too, including American and Russian figure skaters.
Oh, wow.
So you've got a real mix of people here.
Yeah, you've got international implications, you've got the world of sports, and then you've got the political firestorm that erupts.
Right. And this is where Trump comes in. Right. Instead of just offering condolences, he immediately starts pointing fingers.
He did start with condolences, but very, very quickly moved into blaming diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DEI, within the FAA, specifically from the Obama and Biden administrations.
And this is where it gets a bit murky. He says that DEI, could be a factor in the crash.
And when pressed for any kind of evidence, he just said, because I have common sense.
Well.
Which is a bold statement to make when there's a lack of investigation,
Yeah, it's like he's skipping over the whole fact-finding and going straight to his own.
Exactly. Right. Jumping to conclusions right away. And, it's important to remember that the FAA is a huge organization, over 35,000 employees.
Right.
Air traffic controllers, which are directly involved in preventing these accidents, are just one small part of that.
And there have been criticisms about a shortage of air traffic controllers, especially post-pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic caused some disruptions in aviation and a lot of industries, really. And there were reports of staffing issues at Reagan that very night.
So Trump's claim might be a stretch.
Yeah.
But, the FAA has had some challenges in staffing.
There are absolutely legitimate concerns about how the FAA operates, but it goes so far beyond hiring practices.
Right. And instead of looking at those complexities, Trump focuses on his political rivals. And he singles out Pete Buttigieg, the Transportation Secretary, and he uses some pretty harsh language.
It was a very pointed attack, one that Buttigieg didn't let go. He called Trump's comments despicable and said, as families grieve, Trump should be leading, not lying.
Yeah. It's a real contrast in how they respond to this tragedy.
Yeah.
One is focused on blaming, the other's focused on leadership and empathy.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Buttigieg. Chuck Schumer slammed Trump's timing, saying it was inappropriate to speculate while victims were still being recovered.
Yeah.
He talked about, the difference between internet rumors and statements made by the former president.
It's really interesting to think back to, other major events like natural disasters or terrorist attacks, mass shootings. How often do we see this pattern of immediate politicization?
It's almost become predictable, where the event itself almost becomes secondary to how it can be used to further a specific agenda.
So we have this plane crash. The cause is unclear.
Yeah.
And Trump's first instinct is to tie it back to DEI hiring practices.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit. He specifically mentions the FAA's focus on recruiting people with disabilities.
He even mentioned a list of disabilities, including hearing impairments, vision impairments, missing limbs, paralysis, epilepsy, even dwarfism. It's almost like he's trying to paint this picture of an incompetent workforce.
But the FAA has really strict standards for qualifications for all positions.
Right.
And those don't go away just because they're trying to recruit more people.
Exactly. And it really makes you think, is he really concerned about DEI in this crash, or is he using it as a platform to just attack a policy that he's against?
It's hard to know for sure, but his history of targeting DEI initiatives really suggests, a bias here.
Absolutely.
He's been critical of these programs for years.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about this. We're seeing a tragic event being used to just kind of amplify these pre-existing political narratives, even if the connection is weak.
So we have that initial reaction focused on DEI in the FAA, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on to speculate about a whole range of other factors, almost like he's conducting his own investigation.
Right. He talks about the plane's flight paths, the weather, even the temperature of the Potomac River. It was just all this speculation without any real evidence.
And he seems particularly focused on the Army helicopter,
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly mentioning its ability to stop and questioning why it just kept going.
It almost felt like he was trying to blame the pilot, before any official investigation had even started,
Yeah.
trying to get ahead of it and control the narrative. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? This need to figure out exactly what went wrong, even when we don't know the whole story. We saw the same thing with the Titanic. Everyone had a theory, but the truth was much more
Right.
complicated.
Yeah, and that's what we got to keep in mind. I think, it's easy to just latch on to a simple explanation, especially when it's coming from someone like Trump who has such a big platform
Right.
and a lot of influence.
Exactly. But we need to be careful with that, right? We got to dig deeper.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the FAA a little bit more. We talk about staffing shortages, but for anyone who doesn't know much about air traffic control, it's a really tough job.
Oh, yeah.
They're responsible for making sure planes fly in and out of airports safely and efficiently, and they're making decisions, in seconds that affect thousands of lives every day.
And it's not just how many planes they're dealing with. It's weather conditions, equipment problems, pilot errors, all these things that make their job super complicated.
And we're talking about a system that works 24/7, 365 days a year. The constant pressure cooker. And any problems in that system, like the staffing shortages we've talked about, can cause a domino effect.
Right. And the pandemic added a lot of stress to the system.
Yeah.
I mean, air travel dropped suddenly and then it came back really fast. So the FAA had to adapt to these changes, make sure everything was safe, and train new controllers, which takes time.
So even before Trump's accusations, the FAA was already under a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, he basically just added fuel to the fire.
And that's the real danger here, right?
Mhm.
By bringing politics into this tragedy, he might be taking attention away from the bigger systemic problems that need to be solved. And it's not just the FAA that's affected. This kind of politicization can erode public trust. When a leader uses a tragedy to score political points, it makes people doubt their ability to actually help.
Yeah, it creates this feeling of cynicism and distrust, which can be really harmful to society.
Okay, so let's go back to those who challenge Trump's narrative. We mentioned Buttigieg and Schumer. I want to talk more about their arguments.
Yeah, Buttigieg really emphasized the need for leadership and empathy, especially in times of crisis. He pointed out the contrast between his approach, which was supporting the families, making sure there's a thorough investigation, versus Trump's approach, which was blaming others and making it political.
Yeah, he called out Trump for basically exploiting a tragedy.
And Schumer kind of did the same thing. He highlighted how inappropriate it was to speculate and spread rumors, especially when there's still recovering victims.
They both focused on the human cost of the tragedy, which is often forgotten in all the political back and forth.
It's important to remember that there are real people behind all this. People whose lives have been completely changed by this.
So we have Trump pushing this narrative about DEI and the FAA, and Buttigieg and Schumer pushing back, focusing on compassion and responsible leadership. But how did the media handle all of this? Did they agree on how to report on Trump's claims?
That's a great question, and it points to another important part of this story. The media is not a single voice, right? There are so many different outlets, and they all framed this event differently. Some focused on Trump's statements, others focused on the victims and their families, some focused on the investigation and the FAA's problems.
So even the way the public learns about this event is influenced by bias,
Yeah.
the choices editors make. It reminds us that we can't just passively take in the news. We got to be active in figuring out what information we can trust and how to understand it.
Yeah, it's like being a detective. You got to look at all the different perspectives, figure out motivations, and then come to your own conclusions.
And to do that, well, we need to be critical. We need to ask ourselves, who's giving us this information? What are they trying to achieve? What proof are they offering? And are there any other points of view?
That kind of critical thinking is so important these days. We're constantly bombarded with information.
And it's not just about checking the facts. It's about recognizing that even information that seems objective can be presented in a way that subtly shapes our thoughts.
Like that saying, the medium is the message. Even the words use the tone, how a story is placed. All of that affects how we understand it.
So this plane crash is kind of like a small example of a bigger challenge we face today. How do we make sense of all these competing narratives, especially when they involve strong emotions like grief, anger, and fear?
Yeah, how do we make sure those emotions don't make us accept simple answers that don't really explain how complicated things actually are?
This is a lot to think about. Let's take a minute and process all of this. We've talked about a lot, but it's worth coming back to the main question. Was it okay for Trump to bring his political agenda into this tragedy? And what does that tell us about his leadership, especially during a national crisis?
It's a question that goes beyond this specific event. It's about how we as a society deal with tragedy. Do we try to come together and understand each other, or do we use these moments for personal or political gain?
It's a question we all have to answer for ourselves.
Yeah.
And there's probably not a simple answer. But just asking the question is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it means we're thinking critically about the information we're getting and not just accepting whatever we're told.
And that's what this deep dive is all about. It's about giving you the tools and knowledge you need to make sense of this complicated world and to form your own opinions.
It's about helping you become a part of the conversation, not just someone listening from the sidelines.
We've looked at the facts of the plane crash, the initial reactions from politicians, the role of the media, and the bigger implications for how we think about leadership responsibility and the world of information.
We've seen how a tragedy can be used to push certain agendas and how the rush to blame someone can hide the real complexity of what happened.
It's amazing how this one event,
Yeah.
tells us so much about politics and the media today. It's like a textbook example of how information gets twisted and used as a weapon in our digital world.
Yeah, it shows just how important it is to be media literate. We got to understand how different news sources work, what their biases are, and how they might change a story to fit their own agenda.
It's like we need a whole new way of looking at the world, especially when it comes to news.
Think of it like this. You're at a big party, and there are all these conversations going on at the same time. You can't listen to everything, so you pick and choose what you focus on based on what interests you, your background, and who you're with.
And just like at that party, where you might only hear bits and pieces of a conversation and miss some important context, the same thing happens with the news.
Right.
We get bombarded with headlines, sound bites, social media posts, and a lot of times they don't give us the full story.
Exactly. So we have to be aware of what we might be missing, look for different perspectives, and not jump to conclusions based on incomplete or biased information.
It's not just about knowing the facts, it's about being responsible too. When we share stuff online, especially on social media, we're helping to spread that story, whether it's true or not.
And think about how fast rumors and false information can spread online, especially during a crisis. We have a duty to be careful about what we share and think about how our words might affect things.
So it's not just about being a smart consumer of information. It's about being a responsible sharer, too.
It's about being aware of the whole information ecosystem we're all a part of.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, even in times of tragedy, there are often political forces trying to shape the story for their own benefit.
Right.
Second, be aware that issues like what the FAA is facing are complex. Don't just accept easy answers or scapegoating, especially when there's no proof.
And remember...
And third...
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Be an active participant in this world of information. Question the stories you're told, seek out different viewpoints, and share information responsibly.
The world of news and information is always changing, and it's up to each of us to learn how to think critically so we can navigate it.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful. And like always, we encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring the world around you.
Thanks for joining us.